CD 1. Dominoes. Level 3. The Sign of 4. By Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Adapted by Jeremy Page. Read by Wayne Forrester. Published and copyright Oxford University Press 2008. Chapter 1. Miss Mary Morstan. In the summer of 1888, I was living with my good friend Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective, in Baker Street. He was so highly intelligent that he never failed to surprise me. One morning in July, he turned to me lazily and said, "Watson, if I am not wrong, you have been to the post office in Wigmore Street to send a telegram." He was, of course, quite right, but I had no idea how he could know this. I had told no one. "Very good, Holmes," I replied. "Did you follow me when I went out?" "No, Watson," Holmes smiled. "Then perhaps you will explain," I said a little impatiently. "Elementary, Watson," my friend replied. "There's a little reddish mud on your shoe. Outside the post office in Wigmore Street, men are working on the road. I saw them yesterday. The ground there is red, and it's impossible to enter the post office without stepping in it." "As you say, Holmes, elementary," I said. "And the telegram?" "Because we were here together all morning, I knew that you hadn't written a letter. There are stamps and postcards on your desk. So why did you go to the post office and not a post box? To send a telegram, of course." At that moment there was a knock on the door, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, entered. "There is a young lady to see you," she informed us. "Miss Mary Morstan." "Mary Morstan," Holmes repeated. "I don't recognize the name. Please ask her to come in, Mrs. Hudson." He turned to me. "Don't go, Doctor. Please stay and listen to the lady's story." I was happy to do as he said. When Miss Morstan came into the room, she seemed calm, but it was clear that she didn't want to waste any time. She was a young woman, small, with fair hair. Her clothes showed good taste, but they weren't expensive. She had a pleasant face and beautiful blue eyes. She looked serious and intelligent, but not, I thought, rich. Holmes invited her to sit down, and as she took her seat, for the first time, she seemed worried. Mrs. Hudson left us, and our visitor began her story. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I find myself in a very strange situation. I don't understand it at all." My friend Sherlock Holmes looked very interested. "Please, tell us everything," he said. "My father was an officer in the army," she continued. "He was sent to India, where I was born. 2 years later, my mother died, and I was sent home to Scotland. I lived in a small hotel in Edinburgh until I was 17. In 1878, my father returned from India. He sent me a telegram from London asking me to travel south to meet him. He wrote that he was looking forward to seeing me. I took the train to London, then drove to his hotel, but he wasn't there. They told me that Captain Morstan had gone out the night before and had not returned. I waited all day, but there was no news of him, so I went to the police. The next day, I put an advertisement in all the newspapers, but there was still no news, and since then I have heard nothing of my father." "What was the date of his disappearance?" asked Holmes. The 3rd of December, 1878, she replied. 10 years ago. And his luggage? Holmes continued. It stayed at his hotel. I searched his suitcases, but found only clothes and books and some souvenirs from the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. My father worked as an officer at the British prison there for some years before he retired. Holmes thought for a moment. Did your father have any friends in London? He asked. Only one, Major Sholto, who was an officer with my father in India. He had retired 6 months before my father and was living in Norwood. I wrote to him, but he wrote back to say that he didn't even know my father was in England. Very strange, said Holmes. There is more, Miss Morstan went on. 6 years ago, I saw an advertisement in the Times. It asked for my address and informed me that there was good news. There was no name or address. At that time, I had just started working for Mrs. Forrester's family as a governess. I replied to the advertisement, and that same day I received a small box in the post. In it, I found a very large pearl. There was no message. Since then, every year on the same day, I have received a pearl in the post. They are worth a lot of money, Mr. Holmes, and they're also very beautiful. As she spoke, she took a flat box from her bag, opened it, and showed us 6 beautiful pearls. I find your story strangely exciting, said Holmes. Do you have anything else to tell us, Miss Morstan? One more thing, she replied. This morning I received this letter. Perhaps you would like to read it. Yes, said Holmes. And can I see the envelope, please? He studied the envelope carefully. This was posted in London on the 7th of July, yesterday. There's a man's fingerprint on the envelope, probably the postman's. The paper and envelope are expensive, but there's no address, of course. He then went on to read the letter aloud. Come to the Lyceum Theatre this evening at 7 o'clock and wait outside the front door. You can bring 2 friends, but you must not bring the police. I have good news for you. Your unknown friend. What a mystery. So, what's your plan, Miss Morstan? I don't know, she replied. That's why I have come to you, Mr. Holmes. Please tell me what I should do. You must go to the Lyceum this evening, said Holmes. Dr. Watson and I will come with you, won't we, Watson? Of course, I answered, if you think that could be helpful. Thank you both so much, said Miss Morstan. You're very kind. My life in Norwood is quiet, and I have no friends. Shall I come here at 6 o'clock this evening? Yes, Holmes replied. But I have one more question for you, Miss Morstan. Is the writing in the letter the same as the writing of the addresses on the pearl boxes? Yes, said Miss Morstan, taking some papers from her bag. Excellent, cried Holmes. Let me see. The great detective looked carefully at the writing in the letter and the addresses. He seemed very pleased. They were written by the same hand, he informed us. Is it possible that this is your father's writing? He asked. No, his writing was quite different, she told us. That answer doesn't surprise me, said Holmes. We'll see you at 6. Please leave the papers here. Goodbye, Miss Morstan. The young lady stood up to leave and smiled. Goodbye, Mr. Holmes. Goodbye, Dr. Watson. Until this evening, I said, looking into her blue eyes. I heard her go down the stairs and out into Baker Street. From the window, I watched her walk away down the street. A very fine woman, Holmes, I said. Really? My friend replied lazily. I didn't notice. Now, What do you think of this writing? A businessman's, perhaps, I answered. I don't think so, Watson, he replied. The writer sometimes finds it difficult to decide what to do. I'm going out, he informed me, standing up. I need to think some more. I'll be back in an hour. My friend left me alone in the room. Everywhere I looked, I saw the face of our visitor, Miss Mary Morstan. I waited impatiently for 6 o'clock and her return. Chapter 2. A Strange Paper. It was 5:30 when Holmes returned to our rooms. He seemed bright and excited. "Watson," he said, "everything is clear to me now." "Really?" I asked. I was very surprised. Holmes lit a cigarette and sat down. "I've discovered a very interesting fact," he went on. "So, the mystery is solved," I said. Holmes looked at me with his bright, clear eyes. "No, Watson," he replied, "but I am beginning to understand." "What have you discovered?" I asked. I read in the Times of the 29th of April, 1882, that Major Sholto, an army officer, died the day before in Norwood, South London. "But why is that important, Holmes?" I asked. Holmes looked at me kindly. "Let me explain," he replied. "Captain Morstan disappears in London. He knows only one person here, Major Sholto. So we must suppose he visited Major Sholto. But the Major says he never knew Captain Morstan was in England. 4 years later he dies. A few days after that, Morstan's daughter receives a valuable present. There is good news at last. But of what? Of her father, Watson. And why did Miss Morstan start to receive presents so soon after Sholto's death? "I'm sorry, Holmes," I replied. "I have no idea." "Because the Major's heir knows something about this mystery and wants to tell Miss Morstan everything that he knows. Can there be another explanation, Watson?" He finished his cigarette while I thought about his words. "I'm sure you're right, Holmes," I said at last. "But why did the letter come this year, not 6 years ago? And what is this news of Miss Morstan's father? After 6 years without seeing his daughter, he can't possibly be alive." "True," Holmes agreed. "But we'll learn more tonight. And here is Miss Morstan now in a cab. Are you ready?" We stood up and went down the stairs and out into Baker Street. I noticed that Holmes brought his revolver with him. It was clear he thought that we might be in danger. In the cab we found Miss Morstan, dressed in black. She was calm, but her face was white. She seemed happy to answer the questions that Holmes asked her on our journey. "Were your father and Major Sholto close friends?" "Very close," she replied. "Father wrote about the Major in every letter he sent me. They worked together as officers in the Andaman Islands for some time, you see." Holmes looked thoughtful. "Do you have any of your father's letters with you?" he asked. "No, but I have a very strange paper, which I found in my father's desk. It probably isn't important." Miss Morstan took the paper from her bag and gave it to Holmes, who looked at it very carefully. "It was made in India," he told us, "and it seems to be a plan of a very big house with several halls and passages and a large number of rooms. There's a red cross, which perhaps shows where something important is, and 4 black crosses in a line with the words, 'The Sign of 4, Jonathan Small, Mahomet Singh, Abdullah Khan, Dost Akbar. No, I don't understand the importance of this paper, but I'm sure it is important. Keep it safe, Miss Morstan. It may be useful to us. As we drove to the Lyceum, Miss Morstan and I spoke quietly together, but Holmes said nothing more. He was thinking. It was a strangely cold evening, and the sky was grey and full of clouds. There was thick fog in the streets of London, and it was difficult to see the street lamps as we drove along. Everything seemed unreal in their strange yellow light. The grey, wet evening made me feel sad. Miss Morstan, too, looked serious and lost in thought. When we arrived at the theatre, the street was full of people. I paid our driver, and we walked to the main door of the theatre. It was exactly 7 o'clock. Immediately, a small, dark man came towards us and asked, "Are you the gentleman who have come with Miss Morstan?" "I am Miss Morstan, and these are my friends," she replied. The man studied her carefully. "I'm sorry, Miss Morstan," he said, "but I have to ask you if these gentlemen are police officers." "I promise you they aren't," Miss Morstan answered him. "Then will you please follow me?" he said. We followed him to a cab and got inside. He climbed into the driver's seat and whipped the horse, and soon we were travelling quickly through the foggy streets. We had, of course, no idea where we were going or what we would find there. I told Miss Morstan stories of my time in Afghanistan, but I was so excited that I soon realized she was finding it difficult to follow me. Holmes looked out of the window, and from time to time he told us where we were at that moment on our long journey. "We're crossing the Thames now," he said as we drove over Vauxhall Bridge. I looked out and saw the silent water of the river below us through the fog. Our cab moved quickly on, and soon we were in one of the poorest parts of South London. There were streets of tall, grey houses with brightly lit pubs on every corner. Finally, we stopped outside the third house in an ugly street of new buildings. The other houses were all in darkness, but in this house there was a light at the kitchen window. Our driver got down from his seat and opened the door of the cab. We followed him to the door of the house. He knocked loudly, and the door was immediately opened. An Indian servant stood in front of us. "Mr. Sholto is waiting for you," he said. Suddenly, we heard a strange, high voice from inside the house.
"Bring them to me,"
it said.
"Bring them to me now."
Chapter 3. Mr. Thaddeus Sholto. We followed the Indian along a dark, dirty passage and came to a big wooden door. The servant opened it, and we looked into a brightly lit room. A small, bald man stood in front of us in the strange yellow light. He was a very ugly little man with bad teeth and thin lips. He looked about 30 years old.
"I am your servant, Miss Morstan,"
he said again and again in his strange, high voice.
"Please come in. My house, I hope, is a special place among these poor streets of South London."
It was true that we were all surprised by the room. While everything in the rest of the house looked old and broken, everything here was expensive and beautiful. The curtains were heavy and lovely to look at, and the carpet was thick under our feet. Everywhere there were valuable paintings and vases. A beautiful lamp burned in the middle of the room and gave out a sweet smell.
"My name is Thaddeus Sholto, Mr. Thaddeus Sholto,"
the man went on. He smiled as he spoke, and he moved his hands, which were held closely together all the time.
"You are Miss Morstan, of course, and these gentlemen?"
"This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes," replied Miss Morstan, "and this is Dr. Watson."
"A doctor!"
cried Sholto in excitement.
"Dr. Watson, could you please listen to my heart? I really feel quite ill. I am a little worried."
I listened to his heart, but I could find no problem with it, although he was shaking with fear. "You seem to be in good health," I informed him. "There's no reason to be worried."
"Thank you, Doctor,"
he said.
"I've worried about my heart for a long time. I'm sorry that your father didn't take more care of his heart, Miss Morstan. With more care, perhaps he would still be alive and with us today."
His careless words made me angry. Miss Morstan's face went very white, and she sat down. "So, he's dead," she said. "I knew it."
"I can tell you everything," Sholto went on, "and I will tell you everything, although my brother Bartholomew won't be happy. I'm pleased that you've brought your friends with you, because that means there are 4 of us against my brother. But it's very important that no one else knows about this."
"Don't worry," said Holmes. "I won't tell anyone about this, and I'm sure Dr. Watson and Miss Morstan will say nothing." We said nothing, but both nodded our heads to show that we agreed.
"Excellent," he replied. "Excellent. Would you like a glass of wine, Miss Morstan? No? I hope that it won't trouble you if I smoke. I feel a little nervous."
He lit a cigarette, and we sat down around him on the floor with our legs crossed.
"When I decided to write to you," he began, "I didn't give this address because I feared that you might bring the police with you. That's why I asked my man to meet you at the Lyceum. I told him not to speak to you if he was worried. I don't like the police, you see. I find them very unpleasant. My life here is very quiet. As you can see, I have a strong interest in paintings, and I love beautiful things."
"Excuse me, Mr. Sholto," said Miss Morstan, "but I am here because I think you can tell me about my father's death. It's late, so please tell me everything you know."
"We must go to Norwood to see my brother Bartholomew," Sholto replied. "He's very cross with me now. We argued last night because he's angry that I wrote to you, Miss Morstan. He's a dangerous man when he's angry, I can tell you."
"Perhaps we should go to Norwood now," I said, looking at my watch.
"We can't go now," Sholto laughed loudly. "I must tell you the story first. I'm sure you've realised my father was once Major John Sholto of the Indian Army. 11 years ago, he retired and came to live at Norwood in a house called Pondicherry Lodge. He'd made a lot of money in India and had come back to England with a large number of Indian servants. He bought a big house and enjoyed a good life there. My brother, Bartholomew, and I were his only children. When Captain Morstan disappeared, we read the story in the newspaper. Because we knew that he'd been a friend of our father's, we talked about it with him. Together, we wondered what had happened to the captain. We never thought for a moment our father was the one person who knew. After Morstan's story was in the paper, father was too frightened to go out alone, and he always kept 2 bodyguards with him. We never understood why, but he became terrified of men with wooden legs. Some 8 years ago, he shot a black-haired man with a wooden leg who came to the house. The poor man was from the town nearby and was only trying to sell things that he'd made. Bartholomew and I had to pay him a lot of money to stop him going to the police. Now, at last, we understand why our father acted in this strange way, and I'll tell you the story. Early in 1882, he received a letter from India, which made him very worried. When he opened it at the breakfast table, his face went quite white. We never found out what he had read in the letter, but as he held it in his hand that morning, I could see it was short and that the writing was difficult to read. My father had been sick for many years, but now he became seriously ill. One day, at the end of April, his doctor told us that he was dying, but there was something that he wanted to tell us before he died. My brother and I went into his bedroom. He was lying in bed and breathing heavily. He asked us to lock the door and come to him. Then, in a voice full of pain, he spoke. "There's one thing I must tell you," he said. "I've acted very badly towards Morstan's daughter. I've kept all the treasure for myself and given none of it to the girl. Half of it should be hers, but I'm not a man that likes to give money away to anyone, and I've enjoyed keeping all the treasure here at Pondicherry Lodge. When I'm dead, you must send Miss Morstan her half of the treasure, but not before." "I'll tell you how her father died," he went on. "He'd had a weak heart for many years, although he never spoke about it. I was the only person who knew. When we were together in India, we'd acquired the treasure. I'd brought it back to England, and when Morstan arrived, he came to see me to ask for his half. He walked here from the station, but we argued about how we should divide the treasure between us. Morstan became very angry, jumped out of his chair, and suddenly fell to the floor, his face quite grey. He cut his head badly on the treasure chest, and I saw immediately that he was dead. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but I feared they'd think I'd murdered him. Also, I didn't want anyone to find out about the treasure. As Morstan had told me no one knew that he'd come to see me, I decided no one should ever find out. My servant helped me to bury the body, and a few days later I read in the newspapers that Captain Morstan had disappeared. You must understand that I didn't actually kill my friend, although it was wrong of me to hide his body and to keep all the treasure for myself. That's why you must now give Miss Morstan her half of the treasure. The treasure is hidden in—" At that moment, his face suddenly changed. His eyes became wild, and he looked terrified. "Don't let him in," he cried. "Please don't let him in." Bartholomew and I turned to look at the bedroom window. There we saw a terrible, hairy face with frightening red eyes staring into the room from the darkness outside. We ran to the window, but when we got there, the man had disappeared. We returned to our father's bedside, but he was dead. That night we searched the garden, but we found only a single footprint in the mud under the window. We went to bed with heavy hearts that night. In the morning, we found the window of my father's room open. Someone had searched his cupboards and boxes, and on his chest there was a piece of paper with the words, "The Sign of 4." We never knew who had entered the house that night, and the words meant nothing to us.
The little man stopped to smoke some more and sat in silence for a few minutes. We were all thinking about the story that he had told us. Miss Morstan was, of course, very saddened by the news of her father's death. I offered her a glass of water, which she accepted. Finally, Thaddeus Sholto continued his story.
For weeks and months my brother Bartholomew and I looked everywhere for the treasure, but without success. We weren't poor, but with the treasure we would be very rich. That's why I wanted to make sure that you would receive your half, Miss Morstan, as our father wished. Sadly, Bartholomew disagreed and we argued. I decided to leave Pondicherry Lodge and came to live here. Yesterday, I heard that my brother had found the treasure, and that's why I wrote to you, Miss Morstan. Now we can drive to Norwood and ask Bartholomew for our part of the treasure. He knows that we're coming, but I must tell you that he isn't happy."
"It's late," said Holmes, "and I think we should go to Norwood now. Our cab is still waiting outside. Thank you for your story, Mr. Sholto. I'm sure this will be an interesting night." Chapter 4. Pondicherry Lodge. We all got into the cab, and the driver took us quickly to Norwood. As we travelled, Thaddeus Sholto spoke without stopping in his high voice.
"My brother, Bartholomew, is a clever man," he began. "He realised the treasure was somewhere indoors, so he measured all the rooms and passages. He discovered there must be a space somewhere at the top of the house. So he made a hole in the ceiling of our father's bedroom, and that's how he found the secret room under the roof where the treasure was hidden. He brought the chest down through the hole and opened it. He thinks it's worth at least £500,000.
Neither Holmes nor I had expected the treasure to be worth so much, and I could see that Miss Morstan was also very surprised. This would make a great difference to her life. I wanted to be happy for her, but my heart felt very heavy. I managed to say that this was excellent news, but then I fell silent, and I heard nothing more that Sholto said. Finally, we arrived at Pondicherry Lodge. The driver got down and opened the door of the cab. It was nearly 11 o'clock. We'd left the fog of the great city behind, and it was now a warm and pleasant night. A light wind blew from the west, and heavy clouds moved slowly across the sky. Thaddeus Sholto took one of the lamps from the cab, and we walked towards the house. Pondicherry Lodge stood in a very large garden. There was a high wall around the house, with broken glass on top. There was only one door in the wall, and this was heavy and made of dark wood. Thaddeus Sholto knocked 3 times. "Who's there?" asked a deep voice.
"Don't you recognise my knock?"
replied Sholto. We heard the sound of a key in the lock, and the door was opened by a short, ugly man with small, grey eyes. "Mr. Thaddeus," he said. "But who are these people? Mr. Bartholomew said nothing about other people."
"I'm surprised," said Sholto. "I told my brother last night I'd bring some friends with me."
"He told me nothing," the man said, but he let us in. He closed the door behind us, and we followed a path through the garden, which had no flowers or trees in it, and walked towards Pondicherry Lodge. The house was enormous, but square and very ugly. It was dark and silent.
"That's strange," said Sholto. "There's no light in my brother's room, although he knows about our visit."
"But there's a light in that window by the door," I said.
"That's Mrs. Burnstone's room," Sholto explained. "She's the housekeeper. She'll be able to tell us where my brother is."
At that moment, we all heard the sound of a woman screaming. We looked at Sholto.
"That's her,"
he said.
"Mrs. Burnstone. Wait here."
He ran to the door and knocked 3 times. It was opened by a tall, old woman who was clearly happy to see him.
"Mr. Thaddeus," she cried, "I'm so pleased you're here."
The door closed behind the housekeeper and Thaddeus Sholto. We still had the lamp with us, and Holmes used it to look more closely at the garden.
"What are those?"
said Miss Morstan, looking at the holes in the grass.
"Mr. Bartholomew Sholto has been digging here for the last 6 years," said Holmes. "But when he finally found the treasure, it was in the house, not the garden."
Just then, the door opened and Thaddeus Sholto ran out. He looked very frightened.
"Come in!" he cried in his high voice. "There's something wrong with Bartholomew."
We followed him into the housekeeper's room.
"Mr. Bartholomew has locked the door to his room," the old woman explained, "and he refuses to let me in. I've waited all day because he often likes to be alone, but an hour ago I began to fear something bad had happened. I looked through the keyhole into his room and I saw him. The look on his face was terrible. I can't go back upstairs, Mr. Thaddeus."
Holmes, with the lamp in his hand, went upstairs, and I and Thaddeus Sholto, who was shaking with fear, followed him. The detective stopped several times to look carefully at the stairs. He moved slowly, and we waited patiently behind him. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long passage. There was an enormous Indian painting on one wall, and on the other side of the passage there were 3 doors. The 3rd door was Bartholomew's room. Holmes knocked loudly on it, but there was no answer. Holmes then tried to open the door, but it was locked. He crouched down and looked through the keyhole. Immediately he stood up again. It was clear that he was very worried.
"This is serious, Watson," he said. "See for yourself."
I crouched down to look through the hole and saw something terrible beyond it. Light from the moon entered the room through the window, and in that light I could see an unmoving face. The face of Thaddeus Sholto, with the strangest, most frightening smile fixed on it. I turned to make sure that Thaddeus Sholto was still with us, and then I realized Bartholomew was Thaddeus's twin brother. "What can we do, Holmes?" I asked.
"We must enter the room,"
my friend answered, then threw himself against the door. But the lock was a strong one, and the door refused to open. So Holmes and I threw ourselves against it together, and this time it opened. We found ourselves in Bartholomew Sholto's room. It was a small laboratory, full of different things in bottles on the table and on the floor around the edges of the room. One of the bottles on the floor was broken, and some smelly black tar was coming out of it. In one corner of the room there was a ladder, and at the top of it there was a hole in the ceiling. At the bottom there was a rope. At the table, on a wooden chair, sat Bartholomew Sholto. We saw at once that he had been dead for some hours. His hand lay on the table next to a sheet of paper. On the paper we read the words, "The Sign of 4." "What can it mean?" I asked.
"It means murder," Holmes replied. "Look at this."
He showed me a long, dark thorn in the dead man's skin, just above the ear.
"It's a poisoned thorn, Watson," he went on. "You can take it out, but be very careful."
I took the thorn between my finger and my thumb. There was a very small drop of blood on Bartholomew's face where it had entered the skin. Suddenly, I remembered Thaddeus Sholto, who was still standing behind us. He looked terrified. "Are you all right?" I asked.
"The treasure has gone," he cried. "Someone has stolen it. I helped my brother bring it down last night. I was the last person to see him. I left him here, and I heard him lock the door as I went downstairs."
"What time was that?" asked Holmes, suddenly interested.
10 o'clock, replied Sholto. "And now he's dead. The police will think I killed my brother. I'm sure they will. Mr. Holmes, you don't think that I'm a murderer, do you?"
"I'm sure you didn't kill your brother," said the detective, "and I suggest that you go to the police station immediately and tell them what happened. Watson and I will wait here." At Holmes's words, Sholto became a little calmer.
"Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I'll go now,"
he said, and with that he went down the stairs and left the house. Holmes turned to me. "Watson," he said, "we have perhaps half an hour. Sit down. I have work to do. First, I'd like to know how the murderer entered and left the room. No one has opened the door since last night. But what about the window?" Holmes crossed the room and looked carefully at the window. "Yes," he said. "Someone has entered the room here. It rained a little last night, and look, Watson. Here's a footprint and a round, muddy mark. And here's another. Very interesting." "That isn't a footprint, Holmes," I said. "No," he agreed. "It's the mark of a wooden leg." "The man with the wooden leg," I cried. "Do you remember? Thaddeus Sholto told us that his father was terrified of men with wooden legs." "Of course," my friend replied. "But this man with a wooden leg didn't work alone. Could you climb this wall?" I looked out of the open window. The moon shone on the side of the house. "Impossible," I said. "Impossible without help," answered Holmes. "But with a friend at the window and a rope, you could do it. A man with a wooden leg could do it." "Perhaps," I agreed. "But how then did this friend enter the room? The door was locked." "Think, Watson," said Holmes. "He didn't come through the door, and he didn't come through the window." I looked around the room and then cried, "He came down the ladder from the room under the roof." "Of course," Holmes agreed. "It's the only possible way that's left. Let's now examine the secret room, Watson." I followed my friend up the ladder and into the room under the roof. Holmes held up the lamp, and we looked around us. We were in a small, empty room. The roof was high enough for us to stand, but it was a tiny space. "See here, Watson," said Holmes. "There's a door which opens onto the roof. This is how our man came into the house." He put down the lamp, and once again I saw a look of surprise on his face. I soon understood why. On the floor were some little footprints. "Holmes," I cried, "is it possible that our murderer is a child?" "No," he replied, "not a child." "Then how do you explain those tiny footprints?" I asked. "Everything will become clear, Watson. Let's go down." Chapter 5. An Early Arrest. We climbed back down into Bartholomew Sholto's room, where Holmes began to search the floor. "At last we have some good luck," he said, standing up. "Look, Watson, at these footprints. Our little visitor has trodden in this tar here. Can you smell it?" I agreed that there was a strong smell. "Then we have him," cried Holmes. "I know a dog that will be able to follow this smell and take us to him." At that moment the police arrived, with Thaddeus Sholto. "Inspector Lestrade," said Holmes. "Good evening." Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard gave us a long look while Thaddeus Sholto looked very uncomfortable. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," said Lestrade at last. "Perhaps you can tell me what's happened here." "Well," Holmes began, but the inspector stopped him. "Or can I tell you what's happened this time, Mr. Holmes?" he went on. "We have a dead body in a locked room. Some valuable treasure, I understand, has disappeared. Mr. Thaddeus Sholto was with his brother last night and is now very excited." He turned to Sholto. "Did you kill your brother?" Thaddeus Sholto's face went white. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Inspector Lestrade," said Holmes, "you should know that we found this poisoned thorn in the dead man's skin, and this strange paper with the words, 'The Sign of Four.'" "That changes nothing," Lestrade replied. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Sholto?" The poor man tried to speak, but again no words came. "Thaddeus Sholto, I am arresting you for the murder of your brother Bartholomew Sholto. Sergeant Judd, take him away." Judd took Sholto by the arm and they left the room. "I think we have our killer, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade went on. "You're wrong, Inspector," Holmes replied. "But I can give you the name of one of the two men who were in this room last night. It's Jonathan Small. He isn't a very clever man. Although he's tall and has a wooden leg, he moves quickly. He's about 50 years old, an Englishman, but with skin burnt dark by the sun. He's spent time in prison." "And the other man?" asked Lestrade, who was clearly surprised by all the information that my friend had given him. "He's a very strange person," said Holmes. "I hope to introduce you to them both very soon, Inspector. Good night." I followed Holmes from the room. At the bottom of the stairs he turned to me. "Watson, you must take Miss Morstan home. It's very late." "Of course," I agreed. "And then?" Holmes took a piece of paper from his pocket and wrote an address on it. "And then go to this house and ask for the dog Toby. Bring him here to me as quickly as possible. While you're away, I'll talk to Mrs. Burnstone and the Indian servant. They may have useful information for us." Although my friend's plan was not clear to me at that time, I did not ask him to explain. I left him in the passage and went to find Miss Morstan. We travelled by cab to Camberwell in South London, where we said good night. I felt very sad. There was so much that I wanted to say to her, but I knew that I mustn't. She might soon be a rich woman, and I didn't want her to think that my interest was in her money. On the journey from Camberwell, I thought about everything that had happened. The mystery of Pondicherry Lodge and its treasure seemed a very dark one. The address Holmes had given me was in a row of dirty houses in the poorest part of Lambeth, just south of the River Thames. I asked the driver to stop and got out of the cab. I had to knock several times before the door opened. Suddenly, I saw an angry face, which was lit by a candle, looking out. "Go away," said the man. "It's the middle of the night. If you don't go away, my dogs will attack you." "But I want one of your dogs," I tried to explain. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes has sent me." Immediately the man's face changed. "Oh, any friend of Mr. Sherlock's is welcome. Come in." I found myself in a tiny room with lots of dogs of all kinds. the man lit a lamp and introduced himself. "Benedict Sherman," he said, and held out his hand. "John Watson," I replied, shaking it. "I've come for Toby." I could see now that the room contained not only dogs, but chickens. 5 or 6 birds were sitting on the table. Sherman introduced me to Toby, a large, ugly animal, and I took the dog out to my cab. I thanked Mr. Sherman and waved goodbye to him as we drove away. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when I returned to Pondicherry Lodge. I found Holmes at the front door. "Good morning, Watson," he said. "I see you've found Toby. Lestrade has gone. He arrested not only Mr. Thaddeus Sholto, but also all the servants in the house. We're alone here, Watson, except for Sergeant Judd, who's upstairs. Come in." We left the dog in the garden and climbed the stairs to Bartholomew Sholto's room. Judd was asleep in an armchair. "We mustn't wake the sergeant up, Watson," said Holmes with a smile. "Follow me." We climbed the ladder to the space in the roof, where my friend held his lamp above some footprints on the floor. "What do you notice?" he asked. "The footprints are very small," I answered. "They were probably made by a child or a small woman, but there's a big space between each toe." "Very good," said Holmes. "Now come to the window. Can you see the tar here? This is where he put his foot. The tar has a strong smell, and I'm sure Toby will be able to follow him. I myself climbed out of this window and down the drain pipe while you were away, Watson, and on the ground I found this little bag. It contains thorns like the poisoned thorn we found in Bartholomew Sholto's skin. I'm sure our murderer dropped this when he left." "Deadly," I said, looking carefully at the thorns. "But not to us, Watson," my friend replied. "Now, let's go down and find Toby. His work begins now." The dog was waiting impatiently for us. Soon we were running behind him through the dark streets of Norwood. "We're lucky it hasn't rained much," said Holmes. "Rain makes Toby's work very difficult." I was surprised the dog knew where he was going, but I could see Holmes had worked with Toby many times before. "Tell me, Holmes," I said as we ran, "how were you able to describe the man with the wooden leg to Lestrade?" "Elementary, Watson," my friend replied. "2 army officers who are working at a prison in the Andaman Islands discover an important secret about buried treasure. An Englishman called Jonathan Small draws a map for them. We saw his name on the map that Miss Morstan showed us. He'd signed the paper for himself and for his associates. The sign of 4. With this map, one of the officers finds the treasure and brings it to England. Why didn't Small get the treasure himself? Because he and his associates were all in prison." "Are you sure about this, Holmes?" I asked him. "It's the only explanation," he replied. "Major Sholto lives happily with his treasure in Norwood. Then one day a letter arrives from India and frightens him. Why?" "Because the letter told him that Small and his associates were now free men," I suggested. "Good, Watson. Yes, they'd probably escaped. He's now terrified of a man with a wooden leg. We know this because Thaddeus Sholto told us that he once shot a man like that from the nearby town who came to the house. He clearly thought that the man was Jonathan Small. Only one of the names on the map is the name of a white man, so I think we can be sure that Jonathan Small and the man with the wooden leg are the same person." I agreed that this seemed probable. "Well, now let's think about Jonathan Small," my friend went on. "He comes to England for 2 reasons. He wants the treasure, but he also wants to punish Sholto for stealing it. He finds out where the Major lives, but he can't find the treasure. Suddenly, he hears that Sholto is on his deathbed. "And only Sholto knows where the treasure is." "Very good, Watson," Holmes replied. Small arrives at the window of the Major's room, but sees his two sons, Bartholomew and Thaddeus, by the dying man's bed. So he doesn't enter the room then, but comes back during the night after Sholto has died and searches his papers. He finds nothing, but leaves a card with the words, "The Sign of 4. "But why, Holmes?" I asked. "To frighten the Major's sons, perhaps," Holmes suggested, and then continued. "After that, I think Small watches Bartholomew Sholto searching the garden for the treasure. When Bartholomew discovers the room under the roof, Small has a problem. With his wooden leg, he can't climb up to the room, so he brings with him a strange associate. But the associate puts his foot in the tar, and that's why you and I are now moving so quickly through the streets of Norwood with Toby." "So Small himself didn't kill Bartholomew Sholto," I said. "That's right," Holmes agreed. "His associate is clearly a dangerous man. My revolver is ready, Watson."